Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Intellectual Forum at Jesus College. Now, I can see lots of familiar faces, but if this happens to be your first time at the Intellectual Forum, it was founded in 2016-17 by Julian over there, and is now led up by a great team. And the core aim of the IF is to encourage interesting conversation across several different fields. More practically, that looks like public events like this, free public events, ranging from 2 weeks ago, we had former Indian cricket captain Sourav Ganguly. Tonight, we're honoured to have Ruth, and then we've got a current series on death and dying, which will be touching on assisted dying and end-of-life care, various things. So that's just a bit of range. In terms of other things, the IF offer student internships over the summer. They host retreats, contribute to reports, a real vast range of things. Tonight, myself, Claire and Alexis are here in our capacity as the pilot student ambassadors for the IF this year. So we've been testing out a student ambassador scheme for the IF, which has allowed us to get an insight into the running of the events and eventually culminating tonight in planning, organising and hopefully running a successful event. We're honoured tonight to have Baroness Ruth Hunt with us, a visiting fellow at Jesus College, a member of the House of Lords, co-director of Deeds and Words and former Chief Executive of Stonewall. And Ruth has had a plethora of experiences in her professional and personal life, which I'm sure we are all very excited to hear about. Just in terms of format, you may or may not be pleased to know that I'm going to be taking a back seat for most of the talk, and Claire and Alexis are going to be taking the lead. But then at the end, I'm going to be coming back up to host an audience Q&A. So please think of some questions. And if you're watching on Zoom, welcome. Pop your questions in the Q&A tab, and I will try to field as many as possible to Ruth at the end. So without further ado, Ruth, Claire and Alexis.
Welcome, Ruth. We are very happy to have you here today. And I'd just like to start by getting to know you as a person, looking at your upbringing, education, and how all of these things have impacted your later work. So, on this theme, what did, if anything, the young Ruth Hunt want to do when you were a student in our position? And any advice for people?
That's a good first question. Nice softball. I guess that when I was a student back in the day, so I'm now 44, and I went to university in 1998. So before that, I'd been brought up in Cardiff in Wales until I was 16. So I'd been to different schools in Cardiff. My mum and dad moved around quite a bit. And then at 16 moved to Birmingham. So I spent 2 years in Birmingham, 16 to 18, and then went to Oxford at 18. And I guess that when I went to university, I studied English because that was my best A-level subject. So kind of was a classic, didn't really understand the rules, or that you could do a subject at university you hadn't done at A-level, or that you could do, so PPE would have been my natural home, but that's politics, philosophy and economics, and I hadn't done politics and philosophy A-level, so I thought I can't do that. So I did English because that was my best subject. So, and I didn't really know then, and I don't really know now what English graduates do. What I know is that we read very quickly. So we did everything in Oxford in those days was Beowulf to Virginia Woolf, and that's kind of what you did in 3 years. And 2 translations a week, which I learnt off by heart for Old English. So in this year, the Witten of the West Saxons to Price Sigbrit and his kingdom except Hampshire for unjust deeds, I can still remember. So I learnt to think very quickly and work very quickly and write essays very quickly. And I didn't really know what I wanted to be when I grew up. But I think because of my experiences, I knew that I wanted to make the world a better place than the one I'd experienced. So had a real strong sense of social justice, though not the words then. So I went to an all-girls college, St Hilda's College. I was JCR president in my second year, very much on the basis that St Hilda should stay single-sex, because we were a poor college. I mean, Jesus, we didn't have quads or anything. Do you know what I mean? We didn't have quads. It was important to keep the college small, I think, and keep it open to women who wouldn't have gone to Oxford if that college hadn't existed. So I kind of got the campaigning zeal. so I knew I wanted to be making change. I also didn't fully understand milk round. And when I was president of the Students' Union, this was kind of early internet days. People were like, you have to go and work for one of the big four. But nobody ever told me what the big four were. And I didn't really understand, I didn't understand the world. So I ended up working for the university for the first year after AUSU, because I didn't really understand. And my mum and dad didn't know how to kind of network or how you'd kind of work that stuff out. I felt like I missed quite a lot of the rules when I was at Oxford. I missed a lot of the things that you were supposed to get, and was never quite brave enough to lean into those opportunities. I think I was quite a shy, not in the traditional sense, but was worried about being an imposter quite a lot of the time. So never quite cracked the system as well as I should have done, I guess. So I don't know. And at 44 and a half, I don't know what I'm going to be when I grow up. But I think that it was always important to work and earn money and to make a difference, I think, was key for me.
Definitely. And on the same lines again, what do you think young Ruth Hunt would have thought about all that you have achieved so far in your life? Do you think you would have taken any different directions, or?
I probably would have done. I think that one of the things that when I came out when I was 13, so 1993, and in 93 there was something called Section 28 in place, and Section 28 was a piece of legislation that prevented the promotion of homosexuality in schools. So we weren't allowed to talk about gay things. And there was a soap called Brookside that was on, and a character called Beth Jordache, who was played by Anna Friel, kissed a girl, and it was pretty awesome. But then she killed her dad, right? So there wasn't really a lot kind of. And I went to Cardiff Library, and there was a section, and I read The Well of Loneliness and Orange is Not the Only Fruit. Now, they're quite grim books, right? When you're starting out. And I was really worried. I thought, I'm going to get judged. So I thought, I need to be head girl of every institution that I belong to, because then when someone goes, oh, well, she's gay, oh, but she's head girl. So I was head girl of all my schools, and then JCR president, then AUSU president, so and then CEO, and now I'm a baroness. I kind of wonder if I can stop being head girl now. Do you know what I mean? There's a kind of, have you compensated enough for that worry that you had in 93? So I think I would have asked myself more of, what do I enjoy? What do I like doing? And I don't think I ever took the time to say, where do you get your joy? I think I worked very hard to make an impact, and I've made lots of mistakes, and I became CEO at 36. So I was quite young and had quite a lot to learn at Stonewall after being CEO. But I wish when I was at your stage, I'd have taken a beat and just thought, what lights my fire? What brings me joy? Rather than what do I need to do in order to get to the next bit in my career? Do you know what I mean? Because I don't think I ever asked that question. And you were talking earlier about years out and gap years. I never took a gap year. Like I remember when I finished my finals, I cleaned books in Queen's College Library for the summer before I started doing president of the Students' Union, because I needed the money. Do you know what I mean? So I never really kind of went, who am I and where do I want to go? So I think if I was young again now, I'd take a bit more time to ask, you know, what really brings me joy. And I think that's a hard question to answer, but I'd have taken more time to think about it when I was a student, instead of being drunk all the time, smoking and kissing girls and all that kind of stuff.
You live and you learn.
Yeah.
No, so you've told us a bit about your experience at Oxford, and now I'd like to move on a little bit to your work. And you've worked quite a lot to do with education, policy reforms. I was just wondering how you've been inspired to look into this area, still even with your position as a visiting fellow here, and your work at Stonewall, of course, as well, and how has this come about?
Well, I talked a bit about Section 28. So when I joined Stonewall, I was a senior policy officer. I can't remember what the title was, but I was 24, 25. And Section 28 was just getting repealed. So 1997, Labour came in with a big majority. History students, you'll know this, that's now history, came in with a big majority. But it took until 2004 to repeal Section 28. I think it was, maybe it was a bit earlier than that, but it took a long time. So one of the first things we wanted to do was to help schools know how to talk about gay stuff, because there was a whole decade of not knowing where to start with this stuff. And just because the law had changed doesn't mean everybody was up for it. So there had to be a really delicate assessment of what was appropriate for schools. So in 2004, we certainly didn't talk about primary schools. We didn't talk about how you talk about this stuff in primary schools. It was all about GCSE, A-level type things. And we wanted to make it as easy as possible for teachers. And so what we did is two things. The first is that we had £3,000 and we designed a poster that said "Some people are gay, get over it," which was pretty bold in those days, and went on billboards, and we got what's called distressed space. So Viacom, that couldn't sell billboards, gave us the billboards, which meant that "Some people are gay" was put in all areas of poverty, because they couldn't sell Sony. Apple weren't selling anything in these places. So these posters ended up going into parts of the country that almost would never have this stuff. We also then went through the curriculum and worked out how you could integrate, and I use the word gay deliberately, bi was too complicated in those days, and we might talk about lesbian, but let's not rush it, how you'd integrate gay stuff into lessons. So we talked about geography. If you talk about migration, talk about why more gay people might live in Brighton. And if you have a maths question, maybe have two men getting married and working out the budget. And if you did history, have a think about these. So it was so gentle and so surreptitious. So in those days, a book called "I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings" was on the national curriculum. It's a book by Maya Angelou. And it was the one black book on the curriculum in those days. The curriculum was very white English. And "I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings," and sorry to spoil it, the protagonist goes through puberty and thinks she's a lesbian. And in order to prove that she's not a lesbian, she has sex with a man and gets pregnant. And so we talked to teachers about how they could very gently talk about how if you thought you were a lesbian, you didn't have to do that. So it was a very subtle way of bringing this stuff in without going, "Here's the gay lesson." So we had to be really careful. So it was a very gentle time. So everything we did around education was this gentle integration. And in the end, what we did is we designed a program where we were training head teachers to train teachers about how to tackle homophobic bullying, because we knew that if you put obviously LGBT people, as Stonewall staff were, in front of teachers, trying to get them to think about homophobic bullying, we would have a harder job. So we were incredibly thoughtful about how you influence. And it became important to me to make sure that kids who were coming through didn't have the same shame that I had. Sorry, that was a very long answer. But that was kind of what we were thinking, and that stayed with me really, that how do you eradicate the shame that comes from a period of invisibility and disdain? How do you counter that, and how do you manage that in different ways? And that's always been part of my personal and professional commitment, I guess.
Yes, that's very, very insightful. And you've gone into a little bit about your time at Stonewall, becoming CEO at a very young age. And just looking back at your time there overall, obviously such a hard question, what would you say is perhaps one of your proudest achievements? And is there anything that you would have changed or done differently?
Oh, such the loads I've done differently. I mean, let's not turn this into a full-on therapy session. But I think that so Stonewall did a lot to campaign for changes in the law, and Stonewall had, and I didn't do that much actually. I didn't do the law stuff. That was the boys in their smart suits, and people always said to me, "Oh, you won't go down well in politics, Ruth. You're a bit too much." And a lot of people advised me to grow my hair and soften my look and wear blouses, not shirts, and wear waistcoats that were a bit more scoopy and things like this. So there was a lot of kind of don't be too gay was kind of part of the philosophy then, and it was a really interesting time. So I was doing all the policy and the research and the campaigns. So Stonewall was changing the law, but never on their own, always in coalition, always with lots of other people, whereas we were kind of doing some quite neat campaigns. So one of the earliest things we did is we did a survey of lesbian and bi women about their health, because we were going into the NHS And the NHS was saying lesbians don't need cervical smear tests because nuns don't get cervical cancer. So there was an assumption that lesbians weren't sexual, weren't having sex of any sort, so therefore didn't need any preventative health care. So we did this big survey of what was happening, you know, what were lesbians actually doing, and were they enjoying it, and maybe they should have smear tests. So there were these little things that you look back and think, God, were those the fights? And they kind of were. So lots of that kind of stuff. But we also did a wonderful campaign called Rainbow Laces, which still runs today actually, and a company called Paddy Power reached out to us and said, would we work in partnership with them? Now, Paddy Power today, they're quite dodge, right? Like they're one campaign away from being cancelled all the time. So it was quite a risky partnership, but we knew they could get to people we couldn't get to. So they partnered with Arsenal, and we did a campaign about how Arsenal was right behind gay footballers, and you know, lots of kind of you don't have to have your back to the wall when you're with us guys, you know. So it was all a little bit, but it worked, and we got every Premier League team wearing rainbow laces for about a decade. We had a partnership with Premier League, the women's football team, England football team are about to put laces on this year. So it just changed the conversation. So there were lots of these risky moments of how much do you go into these different places. So we did some really cute campaigns that I think definitely were part of moving the needle for LGBT people between 2004 and 2019.
So for someone who was told they wouldn't go down very well in politics, to being elected, well, being made one of the youngest life peers in the House of Lords, how was this transition for you, and especially entering the Lords in after quite a turbulent political time? How was that? Yeah, it was quite a period of change. So it's interesting. So I became CEO in 2014. And Stonewall had always been inside, always inside, never outside. And even in my student politics days, I wasn't particularly good at occupying buildings and having banners. I was always the kind of inside talking to people. So I had Justine Greening was my education secretary and minister for equalities. Then Penny Mordaunt. Theresa May was prime minister. And we had a lovely time. And George Osborne, I remember saying very clearly that trans inclusion was the next thing, and this is what needed to be done, and the Conservative Party couldn't be left behind in the way it had done on sexual orientation. So, gosh, what a time it was, my friends, what a time it was. And then it changed quite dramatically. And I think that one of the things, but Theresa May in her resignation honours asked me to join the House of Lords. And I think that by that stage, I'd already decided to leave Stonewall. I was setting up Deeds and Words with my partner, Caroline. And Caroline and I had worked together for a long time before we fell in love. And she'd said, oh, let's do this together, but are you ready to stop being head girl? Like, are you ready to co-lead this with me? And, you know, being a consultant in business, you are the least important person in a room. You're like, are you ready for that? I was like, yeah, I'm ready for that, I'm ready for that, I'm ready for that. Would you like to be Baroness? Yes, I'd like to be Baroness. So it was a bit of and I think I probably didn't ask enough questions about it, but certainly insisted that I would be a crossbench peer, because I've always been assiduously committed to working across all political parties. And then Brexit, and then lots and lots of things happened, didn't they, over the last 5 years, not least COVID. And I think one of the things that I really got wrong is that I built a movement for centrism, and I built a LGBT advocacy campaign for a centrist time. And I kind of thought that progress that had been made would be banked and would be safe. And that's naive. I know that's naive now. Partly it's you know, I grew up under Thatcher, and then it was, you know, like I've not known this kind of national backward steps on stuff. I've only ever known incremental progress. I didn't realise you could boomerang back. 2016, we had Trump for the first time.
we are where we are now. Do you know what I mean? So the world changed quite dramatically. And I think that my style of campaigning, which was very much inside, I think wouldn't have worked from 2019 onwards, but it wasn't my job anymore. Whereas in the Lords, it's still about building coalitions and building relationships and moving things forward. So the movement I'm building now is very much about helping, having 800 conversations about LGBT issues over a cup of tea and a crumpet. I mean, I never knew I needed a crumpet every day at 4 o'clock, but it turns out that's a thing. But also to those gentle conversations, but also getting as many different people as possible to talk about things. So it's not just me, but also knowing that there's a long time. You have a long view in the Lords. You know, you don't think in these 5-year chunks. So I mean, I smoked until I was 30, so I don't know how long my life period is going to last, but it's going to last longer than a 5-year term. Do you know what I mean? So there's a very different energy to being in the Lords, I think.
Yes. And after talking about political change with the new government here, there's been perhaps more talk about reforms to the House of Lords. What are your views on this, and how would you say envision the Lords in 5 or 10 years?
Well, I was rereading Middlemarch the other day, and Middlemarch talks about the reform of the House of Lords. So it is an ongoing subject that everybody in the House of Lords agrees that reform is necessary. Nobody can quite agree on what that reform looks like. So as a member of the House of Lords now at 44, I'm very young, right? So I've never felt so young, so gay, a woman but not quite woman enough. Do you know what I mean? So I feel like I'm a rebellious teenager. Do you know what I mean? I'm a bit like, come on then, what are we going to do? Let's mix this thing up. So everybody's very clear we need reform, but nobody's quite clear on what. And I think that hereditary peers is the first thing. How far Labour go to carry on that reform, I don't know yet. What I do know is that when the House of Lords works, it is extraordinary and exceptional, and it is utterly imperfect. But as a nation, I wouldn't be without it until we were pretty sure we could replace it with something equally effective. And it is absolutely an imperfect system. There are 700 underutilised NEDs, non-exec directors at certain points. But when there is a discussion about vaccines, my God, do you want that expert standing up and talking about vaccines? So there's something about being able to draw on those different expertise that is particularly powerful. And as a mechanism to hold government to account, particularly when things like the Rwanda bill was going through, I was very grateful that the institution existed with such clever people in it who could understand that that third sentence on the fourth reading of the second page would have a disproportionate impact on, you know, like the cleverness is quite extraordinary. And my expertise will come into play when it's needed as well. So yes, reform, but let's be careful about how we do it, I think seems to be the consensus. And I think when I'm probably 75, I'll be in a legitimate place to have a view on what that reform looks like, but I'm much too young at the moment to have a say.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass over to Claire now.
Absolutely. I was wondering if I could steer the conversation towards religion.
Yeah.
In 2019, you collated a book called The Book of Queer Prophets, and it contains modern-day epistles from really fascinating writers, thinkers, activists. I'd like you to take us back to what made you want to collate this. What was happening that made you feel it was needed?
So I have always tried to advocate for greater inclusion of LGBT people and women, particularly in Christian faiths, in part because I was brought up Christian. And when there are times I'm not sure I believe in God, I don't want God to hear me. So I kind of think that probably means he's part of my narrative. And I go to church, so I have faith myself. And I think that for better or worse, and there'll be a range of views on this, faith has a huge role in this country in how institutions work, how laws are made, how schools are run, how, you know, so they are part and parcel of our society, whether we like it or not. And I think that there has been a lot of discussion about LGBT inclusion in faith communities and Christian communities that often lose the voice of LGBT people themselves. And so when I left Stonewall, lots of people came and said, "Oh, would you write a history of gay rights?" And I thought, there's nothing I want to do less than write a history of gay rights. So instead I thought, well, I want to just get these voices, and they'll be a bit messy and a bit, they won't be consistent, and they won't be rooted in the Greek translation of Leviticus and how it translates into the Hebrew and how that might translate. Like, it's just going to be people's truth. And what I brought together was people going, this is what faith means to me, and this is what being excluded means to me, and this is where my relationship with spirituality comes from. And I think that in all my work, particularly with the Church of England, there is an awareness that the Church of England is such a powerful institution and contains such a multitude of different views on so many different things. Its inability to hold the different views on sexuality is a contradiction in its way of working. It can kind of handle, we can talk about divorce, and we can talk about assisted dying, and we can talk about all these quite complicated things, but for gay people we need to sort of be very careful. So members of the clergy can be gay, but they can't do anything gay, and if they do anything gay, they can't enjoy it, and they need to make sure they've not ever done it again. And it's like this kind of odd way of thinking. I blame Cromwell, incidentally. I think it's all about the monasteries. So there's this, and I just thought we just need to loosen this a little bit and remember the people at the heart of it. And I think that there's lots to be done around making sure that same-sex parents can bring their kids for baptism, and that there's faith schools are not discriminating, and that we can talk about trans people having a new naming ceremony if they want. There's lots of ways in which churches can be more inclusive without us obsessing about sex and marriage. And that's kind of what I wanted to get after with Queer Prophets. And I think it certainly enabled people to see the people behind some of this stuff, I think.
It's really interesting. I mean, as a gay Catholic myself, I've often felt maybe too religious in queer spaces, and maybe too gay in religious spaces. And I was wondering if you've ever felt that. And I think more importantly, if you found places in which you do feel accepted and respected for both your sexuality and your religious conviction.
No, I don't think I ever had that. I think that when I was Catholic before I was gay. So, and when I was, and this is something I don't talk about very much actually, when I was 11 or 12, my mum's sister, my aunt, died in childbirth. And she had 3 kids under 5, and we spent a lot of time with those 3 kids. Those 3 kids came to live with us at weekends and things like that. And they all went to the little Catholic school that we went to. So the Catholic community wrapped itself around us in a way that institutions do very well. And I read the Bible, and I read the Bible then, and I read the Bible again when I thought I might be gay, and I had to read the Bible at 18 when you do English at Oxford, because that's what you have to do. So I've read the Bible, and the Bible has always spoken to me in different ways. And I think it's a beautiful collection of different voices that speak to a shared purpose that is marvelous. And the fact I fancy girls, I never found anything in the Bible that was upset with that. There was nothing, the Bible worries about a lot of things. It didn't seem to have any concerns whatsoever that I might like girls. So I've never found it a contradiction in a way that modern society seemed to feel I should find it a contradiction. So that always felt quite baffling to me. I certainly was much more discreet about my faith than my sexuality at university. So I would not go to CathSoc at Oxford. I wasn't part of the Christian Union. I would go to local church in the outskirts of Oxford. And I didn't bring those 2 worlds together. And it's only when I became CEO of Stonewall that I realised that my faith does shape my approach to leadership. It shapes my values, and it shapes my guilt, and it shapes my convictions, and it shapes. So it's part. I can't disentangle it any more than I can disentangle my sexuality from my leadership. Like these things are part of the things that make me who I am. So I started talking much more openly about it. I go to Mass at the Lord's, and what I love about Mass at the Lord's is that it is the one moment where it doesn't matter what badge you've got. So it's a deeply my lord this, my lord that, and you work in catering, and I'm the Lord, and I need to hold the door open for you. And, my partner Caroline, when she comes in with me, it's Lady Hunt, Lady Hunt. She just like, what is this ludicrous? Why are they calling you Lady Hunt? And so there's this deep respect for the hierarchies. And then you go to mass and you're exchanging the sign of peace with the minister and the catering staff. And it's the one moment where that all disappears. And it's a deeply spiritual moment. But I guess I don't bring my gayness as much into there. Like, I'm never asked to do a reading in that place. It's quite interesting where they don't quite know what to make of me, I think. But in Bethnal Green, I'll go to church in Bethnal Green where I'll kind of, but then I'm on the PCC and I worry about the roof leaking and I worry about the budgets and I worry about, so it's quite hard to find a spiritual home, I think. So I don't think I've cracked it yet, is my point. Do you think you've cracked it?
I think it's a work in progress.
Yeah, I think it is.
I think so.
Yeah.
You talk about your faith and your work, and I wonder if we could move on to deeds and words. Could you just tell us a bit about that and how that came about and what it aims to achieve?
So it's a small business, and I think we've been running it for a while. I think we might stop doing it soon, actually. So me and Caroline have been running it. We mainly work with the Ministry of Defence, and me and Caroline have worked together for many, many years, since 2008. We fell for each other in 2014, which was logistically, administratively inconvenient, to be frank. It didn't really work out appropriately. So she had to leave Stonewall because we're very aware of power. So she told the board, she said, I think Ruth and I have feelings for each other and therefore I think I should leave. And I thought, well, can we kiss first and see if there's a vibe? Dismantle our entire. So she's very ethical, Caroline. So she left, and then so after 5 years, I was like, I really miss working with you because we've done this amazing stuff together. She said, well, let's go and do it together. Let's go and do this stuff. So we basically help very, very senior teams think differently about collective leadership. So we work with quite complex institutions where we're in a situation increasingly where no one person can have the answer. So Tony Blair's just issued a book about leadership where he says that you always need someone in charge. And I don't know what it is about Tony Blair that thinks that only one person should be in charge and whether the Chilcot inquiry suggested otherwise. But there's certainly increasing evidence that you do need a mix of minds. But that needs to be very carefully managed, right? You need to kind of deploy that very smartly and quickly and swiftly. It's not a democratic process, particularly in the military. You need to be able to draw on different perspectives, and that requires significant psychological safety. And you cannot create psychological safety. And psychological safety is a bit abused as a term. People think it just means everybody being very comfortable and cutched up, and as we say in Wales, it's not that. It's about having the freedom to be brave enough to say, I'm not sure. It's about being able to be uncertain and to be able to say, I think we're missing something here. I think we possibly need a different perspective on this. And at a time when institutions are narrowing and distributed and dispersed workforces is exacerbating this, teams need help to expand. And that's what me and Caroline do. We spend quite a lot of time getting brigadiers to expand, not narrow. But we do spend a lot of time together thinking about psychological safety in the armed forces. So I think we might be ready for a different way of working. But it's been a really fun 5 years, actually. Yeah.
I wondered if you could talk more about that, actually, about what it is like to lead an organisation with your partner.
Yes,
how is it mixing work and your personal life?
Yeah, it's weird.
Yeah.
It's when it's good, it's exquisite, right?
Okay.
So we're both. Caroline's an anthropologist and she can be in a room and work out where the resistance is, what's going on, what's happening here. I can communicate quite complex things quite quickly. So between us, we can work very well together. So when it's good, it's very, very good. When she redesigns something mid-sentence and doesn't tell me, and I know what's going on, and I'm like, Caroline, what are we doing? You take it home. Yeah. So there's a kind of moment, and she's a bit older than me, and she's quite like a dog, and and I'm like, well, I'd quite like to spend a bit more time with the world. So it's been a really intense, good 5 years. Yeah. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as a way of life. Okay. Would be my top tip. Yeah. Take it on. Don't do it. Okay. It's good. but it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. You talk about maybe moving on.
Yeah.
And I wondered how it was when you left Stonewall. How was that? Did it feel freeing or did it feel quite worrying to leave that in the hands of an unknown?
Yeah. It was quite worrying. I think if I was CEO now of any institution, I would do it very differently.
Okay.
So I think that when I became CEO in 2014, I had an idea about a heroic leadership model that I think that is very seductive in a campaigning organisation, particularly when the person becomes synonymous with the campaign and there's backlash, right? So you kind of want to protect your people. So you're like, I am the face of this and I'll take this. What you do is you're not as strong as the organisation should be when it is more shared and more collective. So if I was going to be a CEO now of any organisation, I would take a much more collective leadership approach to managing that. I think that I should have anticipated a lurch to the right, and I think I would have done things differently. But I think it was a big part of my life. So 24 to 40 is a long time. 24 to, I can't remember, yeah. But it was also time to go, because I think in a bit of a Catholic way, I was making amends for the life that I didn't have. And people, sometimes when I speak to American audiences, I do quite a lot of corporate gigs, and they pay very well. And they basically just want rent-a-gay, right? So you kind of go and you tell your gay story, and they pay you a lot of money, right? So it's all just a waste of time. But this guy was like, "Oh my God, you so paid it forward." And I was like, "No, I don't think I did. I don't think I did pay it forward. I think I was making amends for a world that I wanted to exist and didn't. Like, I think it was quite a selfish act, actually, and almost an act of penance. It was like, I need to make this better so that nobody else has a hard time. And I think I kind of had done my time, and it felt a bit like I'd done my time, and it was time to, you know, running your own business does earn more money than working at a charity instantly, with London mortgages. So there was something about kind of going, I've done my bit, and I'm tapping out now, and I think it was the right thing to do. But finding a purpose when you don't have that is an interesting question.
Yeah, and talking about tapping out, I promise we're getting to the Q&A soon. Not at all. But I just wanted to mention, I know you're coming back to Jesus College in a fortnight, and you're going to finish our series on sin, and it's on sloth or sloth, however you say it. I wondered if you could give us a taste, or if you're keeping it under wraps.
So it's been a series on the 7 deadly sins.
Quite, yeah.
And I haven't seen the other 6, but I think I need to. Should I pitch it right? And I got sloth. I think I must have chosen sloth. I would have had some agency in that. But I think sloth's really interesting. I think sloth is quite widely I think sloth is about depression. I think it's not depression in the modern sense. I think it's about not being able to find the energy for life. I think it's about being lost, actually. I think sloth is a way of describing being quite profoundly lost and being far away from God and quite alone. So I think I've got a 10-minute pitch, and I'll not a pitch. What do we call it? A sermon, something like that. Yeah. So I'll do a 10-minute sermon on where I think sloth fits into quite a state of malaise, where you feel very, very far away from hope. I think that's when sloth is a product of that, and I think I'm going to get into that, but I haven't written it yet.
I'm looking forward to it. So we're going to move on to the Q&A now. Please feel free to ask any question back. Or if we've not got any yet, we've got some on Zoom maybe.
I'll start with the Zoom. I can see we've got quite a few people on Zoom, so please pop your questions in the Q&A section and I will see them. If you're in the room, raise your hand, and we've got a helper who will run around with a microphone and make sure you speak to the microphone so we can hear you on the live stream. Need.
Hiya. So I'm Eve, and I was wondering so you talk about in your time at Stonewall how you didn't necessarily anticipate a lurch to the right. Do you think that potentially the approach of respectability politics that was a lot of the 90s into 2000s move, and also with the repeal of Section 48 and how you then had to be a very presentable form of gay, essentially. How do you think we can now, is it a case of turning it around and not doing respectability politics? Is there any hope in doing that because of the sort of reactionism that politics has now become? What would your approach be to that now, knowing what you know?
I don't think there's a clear answer to that, and I wish there was, and I want there to be. I think that my instincts and respectability politics, I think I would have also described it as assimilationist, actually. So certainly during 2004 to 2019, it was very much, we're just like you. You know, we want the same rights as you, we want the same, and we're very tidy and neat, and there's nothing messy about LGBT people at all. We're just like heterosexual people. And I think that was arguably extraordinarily effective, and yet lots of people were also left behind and left out of that narrative, right? So there was a cost to that, and I think history will need to reflect on whether that was a price worth paying, and whether if we had taken a less assimilationist approach, we'd have made as much progress, or arguably in some areas we would have done, and I'm not sure. It's something I think about a lot. In terms of where we're at now, my approach is always respectability, in terms of being inside, and the Lord's thrives on that, so I'm in the right place. My next job was not running a campaign, or running a march, or my job was in the Lord's, right? So I think we find our role, and I know that I will achieve more through that approach, and the Lord's is in an extraordinarily powerful position to decide what laws are passed or not, right? So I'm not going to throw away that shot. However, what does the world need now? I'm not sure, because to what extent is Trump a product of that rejection of respectability, or to what extent is Trump, would Trump have happened sooner if we hadn't, I don't know. I genuinely don't know, and I wish I did, but I think that I crave centrist ways of working, and I think that that's my hope is that we will always drift back to the middle, and I think in the UK we do. I don't think in the UK we particularly like being on the edges of a centre. I think if you look at all the work from More in Common, so More in Common is a really interesting organisation. They've just done some joint research with the University of Oxford that found that 3/4 of the population utterly support equality, diversity and inclusion training, but they want it to be relevant to their work. They want it to be relevant to what they're doing. They don't like the term white privilege. They don't like being told that they've got more advantages over someone else. Now, whatever I think about that doesn't say to me, all this is woke and let's throw it out. What that says to me is we're a nation of people who like fairness, but nobody should tell me that I haven't had a hard time. And that's a very British way of doing things, right? That feels very middle ground to me. So I think naturally we're a middle ground. And I think our Brexit result of 48-52 speaks to that as well. We're not on these edges. But I don't know, I guess that's down to you now. Like, you're the future now. So there's something about, we'll have to see what works, but I think we will always drift back to respectability in this country, and I feel okay about that. But I know my siblings on the internet would disagree with me.
Thank you. I'll just pivot to Zoom for one online question, then we'll come back to the room. Catherine Twining asks, Ruth, have you been involved in the Church of England's LLF, Living in Love and Faith Development? And if so, please tell us something about it.
So the LLF, Church of England, Living in Loving Faith, was a large-scale consultation exercise where members of the Church of England talked to people about how they felt about issues of human sexuality, and produced a very, very long policy book that said, be nice to LGBT people, but gosh, isn't it terribly complicated? I am slightly summarising that unfairly. Then concluded that we could bless some marriages if you want to, but if you don't, that's okay, and you should probably approve it via a bishop, but if your bishop doesn't want, so I think they've got themselves into a bit of a knot. And I think they've made it a bit tricky for themselves to get out of that knot. I think it actually roots back to how they resolved the issue of women bishops, but that's a whole other story. I think that the issues of human sexuality for the Church of England is sometimes a bit of a proxy issue. I think one of the big things I had to push in Lambeth Palace was that African Christians were not a separate group to gay Christians. There was a kind of assumption that these two communities were diametrically opposed, as if the world is not richer than that. And I think that there has been a struggle to ask the right questions about human sexuality in the Church of England. I think that anything that puts people off finding peace in a church is a bad PR model when the number of people supporting the Church of England is going down quite rapidly and the number of gay people who want to be part of it are going up. From a quite a simple PR point of view, you might want to shift your policy to get more bums on seats. So I think they haven't really helped themselves with their experiments, however well-meaning and well-intended it was. That being said, there is no one Church of England. It is a vast, sprawling institution with very, very different views and very, very different people. And I have enjoyed very strong relationships with Archbishop of Canterbury's and York's over the years, who have been utterly willing to talk. I have sat in rooms with bishops who, with utter love, have told me that they really can't support who I am, but would love to hear from me, which is a damn sight more civil than what I get on social media. So I find arguing with Christian evangelicals quite joyous on occasions, frankly, compared to some of the nature of the debates that are happening in other settings now. And I think we've made quite a lot of progress, but I think there's more to be done. But I don't know if the Archbishop of Canterbury is still the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was when I came in the room. I don't know if he still is.
We'll go to the Jen at the back first, and I'll come to you next.
Since '97, I think it's fair to say that the LGBT rights revolution, if you like, has happened. You know, that progressively all sort of parts of the law have essentially fixed discrimination. But I think it's fair to say that throughout most of that, the law has led public opinion in the sense that you know, the public hasn't been entirely sort of on side with it, like in terms of 50-50, but the law has kind of changed it, and public opinion is then caught up. I wonder what your opinion would be on trans rights now. You know, is the law essentially catching up with public opinion, or is it that it needs to lead it and public opinion will follow?
I think I used to agree with you. I'm not sure it was as simple as that. I think there's some really interesting research called the tipping point research that suggested that 25% of a group needed to be in favour of something in order for something to come. And I think that if I think about every single law change for LGBT people, and absolutely recognise the distinction, there was always 25% in favour. I think there was 25% in favour, I would say 70% indifferent and 5% deeply objecting. So I think that there was enough momentum, but I think the law always came when the government was sure it wouldn't upset too many people. And I think that's been rewritten a little bit. So if I look at 97 to 2014, every law change that came much later than it should have done for a government with that much majority. So civil partnerships was 2004. The right to not be fired from work was an EU directive. It didn't come from a Labour government. It came from the EU. The right to not be discriminated against in the provisions of goods, facilities and services was 2008. Gays in the military, like these were all came as a result of quite a lot of fight. So I think Labour introduced laws when they knew it was safe enough. The outlier on that is in 2004, the Gender Recognition Act. So in 2004, the Gender Recognition Act, as a result of case law, went further than I think the country understood, which was granting the right for someone to fully transition on the basis of a declaration and a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, etc. Gender Recognition Act was quite revolutionary, which meant that when it came to 2014 and same-sex marriage, that didn't come from popular views, popular consensus, that came from the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats in coalition said, we're going to do this. Tories went, we better add. Like, it was that kind of simple, because I remember being in the rooms and going, Conservatives are not going to go for this. So on our estimate, same-sex marriage would have been 2018-19. 2014 was much sooner. In Ireland, when they introduced same-sex marriage, they introduced a reform to the gender recognition at the same time. So they twinned it together. We didn't ever do that because Stonewall didn't do trans, and therefore those laws went out of sync. So I think that it's hard to know what came first in some of these different things. I almost feel that legislation has been slow. Conversion practices is exactly what we're seeing now. So it's been discussed to introduce legislation to ban conversion practices. It's an incredibly complex piece of law, incredibly complex unintended consequences of that. And that's a kind of classic headline grabbing, I'm going to do it without doing the homework. So, and I feel a bit of I've become a baroness, right? I'm a bit of a geek about the legislative implications of introducing conversion practices. So I wonder more if it became a vote winner and then a vote loser, then a vote winner. And I think that we're not quite sure whether it's cool anymore to be good at LGBT stuff. And I think that that's always been the compulsion. Whereas in 2009, my mum would have wanted Labour to say something about LGBT people. She now wants them to say something about the NHS. So poverty comes into all this as well, right? So I almost think that in ages of austerity, our capacity to tolerate this sort of thing changes as well. So nothing was simply one thing, as Virginia Woolf said. And I kind of think that becomes most acute in these moments of international and national crisis when there's lots of other things going on. It's not a very good answer to you, I'm afraid. It's a bit like yours. I'm becoming old. I'm like, I don't know. When I was 24, I'd have gone, this is how it is. And now I'm like, I don't know, maybe on the one hand and on the other.
Question at the front.
Thanks.
We'll just get a microphone.
Thank you. You said some very thoughtful and sensible things about the House of Lords. I was just thinking, when did I last hear anybody say anything intelligent about the House of Lords? I can't actually remember anybody. You also talked about things during your life moving forward to make you feel young again. I'm nearly twice your age, and that's been happening all through my life as well. And I also thought it would all carry on going forward and it can't go back, and anything that goes back is not be a blip. But I'm not sure it is a blip. And even if it was, we could turn it into permanent progress backwards by not understanding what we need to do. So I'm going to suggest something. When you and Caroline stop doing what you're doing at the moment, which is working perfectly, this is what we want you to do. What I want you to do. I think democracy is now under threat. And why have we let that happen? Because we don't understand democracy. We don't teach it. We know nothing about it. You at Stonewall dealt with a similar situation. How on earth are we going to change everybody's view and instruct them about this subject, which they don't understand? I think we need that sort of approach with democracy. And you're obviously good at that.
Okay.
So I think that's what we need. And you need somebody like you who's been on the inside and understands how it works, but who doesn't come across with any of the stereotypes that we've all got about people in politics, to get us to take democracy seriously and do something about it.
I will do my best. I agree with you. I think that I think there is an absolute decline in faith in institutions that I think is deeply serious and of deep concern. Because when we lose, I think we see it in the Met Police, that you can only police through trust, and once your trust is eroded, then you lose faith in it. I think once we lose faith in our institutions, society is jeopardized and democracy falls. And I worry about democracy in the US because and not because of who's won, but because of the lack of checks and balances now about maintaining that. And I was listening to something, I've been listening to so many deeply depressing podcasts about how George Washington and then Hamilton and I can't remember, but how it was this much was in jeopardy at the founding of America. But of course, everybody was discussing how democracy would look in America. Like the discussion was alive with what do we want our democracy to be? Now the question is not what do we want our democracy to be? People aren't having those conversations. And I remember someone saying to Trump, you know, do you think people want a democracy? He went, no, I think people want to be told. I think people want to be told what to do. And I think there is a sense that people are, that's becoming the prevalent narrative, that democracy isn't serving people. And the Lord is not a good counter to that, to which, you know, which is slightly problematic. I do lots of school visits, loads and loads of school trips. We do loads of school stuff in the Lords. And what kids are saying is, what difference does it make? What difference does it make? My dad has not had a job. We can't afford the food bill. We're worried about the heating bill. I don't know how voting would help me. And I think there's something about the stories we tell when there is no, when kids don't have shoes to go to school, we've got a problem. And austerity hasn't addressed those problems. And what's interesting about some of the discourse now, we know you need to give kids free breakfast because they do better at maths. I think we should give kids free breakfast because they're hungry, right? So there's something about, like, we've kind of lost sight of some of these basic human things that people will go, actually, my MP really helped me sort that out, and my dad can afford to pay the rent now. And, you know, so there's big institutional issues going on that I think jeopardizes our entire democratic approaches. And the changes in Europe is terrifying in terms of the demolition of democracy. And we are at risk of being at war on three fronts, and we've been here before. And I think it's a very deeply worrying time. Sorry. But yay, gay people.
It's at the back there.
So what would you say is the most important piece of advice for young people who want to basically do what you do? And become actors. Like, do I have to become the president of the JCR?
How to become an activist? Well, I think that I think being a JCR president absolutely was stage one in my career, and becoming president of Oxbridge University Students' Union was stage two. However, that does not mean they are the only stages available. I think the thing about becoming particularly president of Oxford Students' Union is that it meant at the age of 21, I managed budgets, people, stakeholders, because there were 32 JCR presidents who were all arrogant and obnoxious and had their own ideas about things. Yeah. I sat on university governing bodies and councils, and I persuaded fellows at Oxford to introduce sustainability measures and not invest in Saudi and all these kind of things. So it just gave me experience that you never get in my first job. So I would always endorse student sabbaticals and student political roles. A, because it teaches you how to influence and gets you in the rooms where you need to persuade people to do things they don't want to do. And it's just experience that is just irreplaceable. However, there are other ways of being an activist. I think that there's a really interesting moment, and I think it speaks to your point about respectability, about where activists are at the moment and how effective they are, and what works and what doesn't. And I think that I often have to go back to an idea called humble inquiry, and it's by Edgar Schein and his son, I think, Peter Schein, and it's worth looking up. And humble inquiry can be summarized as three questions that anybody who's trying to influence should ask themselves. Is number one, does it need to be said? Number two, does it need to be said now? Number three, does it need to be said by me? And if the answer to that first question is yes, the second question yes, the third question yes, then speak. And if the answer to any of those questions is not yes, then hold back. And I think activism is often about making sure that you create the right circumstances for someone else to say something. And that's not necessarily about empowering or putting another chair around the table or any of that stuff. Sometimes it's about Earl Russell in the House of Lords speaking about boxing and the attack on the women who were boxers instead of me saying it. Because when hereditary peer Liberal Democrat Earl Russell speaks about the rights of trans women, it is significantly more effective than me standing up and saying it. So sometimes it's about working out how you influence, who you influence, and getting experience of that, and recognizing that sometimes it's about deploying other people is the best experience you can get to be an activist. So do that in any way you like. You don't have to be a JCR president or a sabbatical, but think about influence first and foremost rather than activism, and your activism will be better for it. Would be my top tip.
So before coming to Jesus, I went to UCL, which recently cut its ties with Stonewall, under the guise of sort of protecting freedom of speech. And I wondered if that was pushback that you faced during your time with Stonewall, and certainly now with Lexington's, like this idea that LGBTQ plus activism infringes on freedom of speech.
I didn't, and I don't. So when I was Stonewall CEO, there were, I think, 900 companies who were part of the programme. But that programme was, for its time, it was a very specific programme that was designed to do exactly what you were describing. So it's the Diversity Champions programme, and companies pay £2,500, like not a lot of money, and would do stuff that we recommended to help make their organisations more inclusive. And they would change their policies, and they would ask the questions, and they would monitor sexual orientation, and they would do this, that, it, like, and every 3 years we'd make it a bit harder, and we'd kind of keep pushing it. And it's probably one of the single most effective campaigns that I've been part of, because IBM would compete with Barclays to do better on the Stonewall measure. And if Barclays had introduced a paternity leave policy for gay men who were experiencing surrogacy, then my God, McKinsey were going to do it too. And I'm happy with that as an outcome, right? So it was a very effective campaign. It led to a race to the top, and people were very proud of their association, and it was inexpensive and all designed to be able to be done very easily. It also led to the creation of LGBT networks in every single one of these organisations that still survive today. So that was groups of LGBT people and their allies who were all sitting there going, well, I think the policy you've done on that should probably change. So from a campaigning point of view, it worked, and it works, and it works. Because it was the single most effective campaign we ran, it comes as no surprise to me that in 2019 onwards, those who disagreed with Stonewall undermined that and said, you shouldn't be part of it anymore, and were very successful in that. But I think also, to the respectability point, what Stonewall was asking for in that index went further than I took it. So I kept it, in my day, the questions were, there was always one organiser, like a good chunk of organisations who were doing what we were asking. So if Barclays were doing it, then we would make Lloyds Banking Group do it. Whereas I think it got to the stage where it was asking for stuff that nobody was doing as a way of stretching. And arguably that's a legitimate campaigning approach, right? But it's just not the one I took. And so when it was asking for more than people were doing, it kind of, people were like, well, I'm getting loads of freedom of information requests, I'm getting loads of attacks on Twitter, and you're asking me to do things I'm not doing, so I'm not even doing very well. This is all too complicated. So things have their time, right? However, the freedom of speech issue is an interesting one, because I think higher education institutions have been grappling with freedom of speech issues since Aristotle, right? I don't think this is a new thing. And in my day, we had a tradition every year where the union president would invite someone controversial, and then the AUSU president would do everything they could to stop the union president inviting the person who was controversial. So the AUSU president would get a load of activists outside the union going, no, don't we believe in freedom of speech, but you shouldn't be sharing your platform with someone controversial. The union president would be like, we're the bastion of freedom of speech, we're going to have someone controversial. We would all write it up in our CVs and we'd all get our jobs, right? So it was all just part of the game, right? It was just part of what we all did. So I don't think that's changed particularly. I think what has changed is the anxiety about how we navigate disagreement. And I think there's kind of been a real anxiety about how we disagree well that I don't quite know when it happened, except I know that social media is the bastion of disagreeing really badly. So I think we've all become a bit de-skilled at disagreeing well, because it's all like so this meanness is horribly mean. It's why I quite like the bishops, because the bishops are like, you are going to hell, my dear, but you're very good. So there's a kind of like, there's a meanness that I personally hate. I can't stand it. So I think universities have become more paranoid about that. I think we've sought more absolutes rather than grey. Virginia Woolf, and Nothing Was Simply One Thing, has kind of got lost a bit. And I think we've all become a bit frozen, and that's all been stoked by the political manifestation of nobody has any freedom of speech, which is then juxtaposed with, but you can't take down a picture of the Queen. So the freedom of the speech complaints is very inconsistent. It's the inconsistency of the academic argument that distresses me slightly. The aesthetics of that really bother me. So freedom of speech, but don't say bad things about the Queen, or freedom of speech, but don't, it is my freedom of speech to not share my platform with someone. That is absolutely my right. That's my freedom to do that. So it's the inconsistency of the intellectual rigor that distresses me. It doesn't worry me too much that people aren't, because UCL will always be in having these deep conversations about where it stands on things. That's not a new thing. But it hasn't affected Decent Words, no. They still want us to come and do stuff.
It's kind of on student politics again. I think in action, there's been a lot of panic and no one to put it in student groups. Like, I write for a newspaper and it feels like every article saying here's why everything's awful and here's what it's not going about it. Do you think there's any way we can channel that panic into something a bit more actionable?
Yeah, so I think the mic isn't working very well. So the question was, how do we? The world's all going to hell, but so it's all awful. But is there any hope in the world? And this is a bit of the Christianity, which is I do believe in finding the little big things, right? The ways of finding your way of making the world better on a small scale, and it's not unique to Christianity. They just express it in quite an interesting way. So Saint Teresa and Saint David, I'm Welsh, was always like, do the little things, right? Do the little things. And I always tell a story about that you can have influence on different levels and different scales depending on how tired you are and what your capacity is. And during COVID, me and Caroline worked with a group of people at my church to set up a food bank. And in Bethnal Green, it was a non-referral bank, so anybody could come, because a lot of food banks you need a referral, and lots of people in Bethnal Green are undocumented and people were hungry. And so we set up this food bank, and meat products in a food bank are £2 a tin, and veggie products are £1 a tin. So we always had lots of veggie products, but not many meat products. And the most popular thing was a Fray Bentos pie. And if you're too young to know, a Fray Bentos pie is £2, and you take the lid off, and it's meat, kind of, and puff pastry on top. And you put it in the oven, and the puff pastry puffs up, and it's really nice. And that, and a tin of potatoes, a tin of peas, bloody brilliant. And there's always a shortage of this stuff, right? And sometimes, like, we've been all over the place, and I'm so knackered. All I can do is buy a couple of Fray Bentos pies and chuck them in the basket, right? But sometimes I've got the headspace to send a message out to all volunteers, get them to go to their local shops, do a bit of a drive. So that week we'll have 40 Fray Bentos pies. Sometimes I've got my head together and I've been writing to Baxter's to see if they will sponsor Bethnal Green Food Bank and supply a year's supply of Fray Bentos pies. And sometimes if I'm feeling really up for it, I will talk in the House of Lords about the need to introduce a universal basic income and eradicate the need for a food bank so that we don't need to buy any pies. But sometimes all I can do is buy a pie. And I think that when I'm despairing and I'm slothing, but at least I can buy a pie. And I think we've all got to find our equivalent of a pie, however little that is, because otherwise we get stuck in the despair. And we've got to find our way, and sometimes that means we can change the world, right? And sometimes it means we can just buy a pie, but find your pie. Like, do something, however small it is. Do the little big things that just will contribute to a greater, better world, I think.
We'll have one at the back and then final one at the
Hello, I'm aware you can't see me very well. I'm glad we've moved away from politics because this question is more about your own personal experiences. How have you seen your experience of discrimination change throughout time and throughout your roles that you've had throughout your life?
That's a really interesting question, and it's changed dramatically, but I think it also, my expectation of it has changed too. So I think that sometimes, certainly when I was younger, I would brace myself for discrimination and almost bring it upon myself in my, like, do you hate me? So no. Okay. So one of the things I've noticed in the Lords, there's three biases. There's affinity bias, perception bias, and confirmation bias, right? Affinity bias is working with people who are like you, and we all have affinity bias, right? A college is affinity bias. We all like hanging out with people like us. And the Lords has an affinity bias that if you speak well, and you look well, you belong. And I really want to belong in the House of Lords. And when I started, I thought I need to be a bit less gay, and I need to just kind of change my look a bit. And I bought these tops that I was wearing under my suits. And Caroline was like, do you think you now pass as straight? Like, do you think you've suddenly kind of toned down that enough? So we change ourselves a bit. Perception bias is, well, and there are certainly people in the House of Lords who look at me and think she is a radical extremist who's going to abseil into the Lords and glue herself to the benches and do everything she can to woke us to death. And that's definitely some people's perception. But also what's going on is my confirmation bias, which in the word of Radiohead is we do it to ourselves, we do, and that's what really hurts. And that's my anxiety about their perception bias. And the vast majority of people in the Lords don't know who I am and don't care. So my worry about their perceptions and their biases against me is sometimes so overwhelming that I make it hard for myself. That being said, the world is a bit shitty, right? There is definitely prejudice out there. And I have certainly experienced that in different ways. I think how it manifests itself now, me and Caroline have definitely experienced a significant uptick in being told we are in the wrong toilets. And over the last couple of years, I have been told I've been in the wrong toilet more often than in my previous days. And me and Caroline both do a thing where we stand up very tall and push our chest out and speak a bit high and go, no, it's okay, we're in the right toilets, don't worry. And we were in Liberty, which is a dead posh shop in London. And this woman followed Caroline out and went, I'm so sorry. And I was like, no, it's absolutely fine, don't worry. And this woman said, have you thought about growing your hair? So the policing of gender is definitely having an impact on the dykes amongst us. And the shouting in the streets has gone up again, definitely experiencing that. I don't think I would experience the same level of discrimination when applying for a job as I probably would have done a decade ago. So I think some things have changed, but the fear and hostility about the other feels more acute now than it did 7, 8, 9 years ago.
I think we've only got time for one more, so final question.
Hey, you talked about like the fear, hostility, the meanness on the internet. So I wanted to ask, what do you think is the role of anger in campaigning? Do you think it's something that, unites us, motivates us, or do you think it's not worth it because it like antagonizes us against other people?
It's a really good question. So if you couldn't hear what's the role of anger in campaigning? And I know that I am least effective when I am angry. I get less done. I have a rogue eyebrow that goes up. I am more contemptuous. I can be intellectually, I can be quick, and I can make someone feel stupid, and I can evoke shame. And I know that if I do that, I lose. So if I am in a position where I am drawing on my anger in order to do something, it's time to go for a little sleep. That doesn't mean that anger doesn't have a place, but it is not the tool to draw on when you are trying to influence. It is the fire that gets you up, but it is not the thing that moves people. And I think it's because it's linked to shame, and shame never works. So I know that when I'm tired, I can be more impatient and more angry, and I always regret it. So in my experience, and others may have different experiences, I don't think it achieves what you want it to achieve. So do it over a pint, but then get your head back in the game. And stay off social media, like all of you, just delete it. Don't do it. It's just a waste of your energy.
Well, as I said, I think that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much to Ruth for coming up to Cambridge today and giving us all the opportunity to hear from her, and we've all found it really interesting.